Wait a second, you think I'm talking about economic privilege. I'm talking about the privilege you get by simply being white. That's it. Hello, I'm Claudia Rankine. I'm a poet and playwright, and I'm here to discuss the making of Just Us, an American conversation. Just Us began before it began. I was teaching a class at Yale on constructions of whiteness. What does that mean? How does whiteness function in the world? And many of my students would interview their suite mates and their friends. And so I thought I would do that too, which had to do with me literally challenging myself to approach white men in airports and ask them about white male privilege. I chose that because liminal spaces are places where you are in contact with people who are strangers as you move from one place to another. Most likely you don't know these people, but you end up spending a lot of time with them. You are waiting for the flight. You're on the flight sometimes for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours. Because I travel a lot for work and I'm often in first class, I'm often sitting next to men who also travel, and it's often men who often travel for work, and many of them are white. A lot of these men who travel for business, they drink quite a lot, so they can become very chatty, especially on these long flights over the Atlantic. So it really was a kind of perfect space for an experiment on the conversation. And I thought, yeah, why not? Just ask them what is their understanding of their white male privilege. And that's how the book began, in a sense. The first major essay in Just Us explores not just the conversation, but me being able to begin the conversation, because that wasn't a given. It's hard enough approaching a stranger and then launching into a conversation that we don't normally have, in fact. And for many people, the idea of whiteness was not even a concept. Even as there are white people in the world, the socialization that we've had is that whiteness is invisible and that what we would consider whiteness is just people. So a Black person is walking down the street and is surrounded by people. What that really, translate that, it means a Black person is walking down the street and is surrounded by white people. So just even calling out these people's whiteness was sometimes news to them. And it felt like making a leap to begin the conversations. By the time I was able to do it, people, were game. They were like, yeah, I'm a white guy. And the part that they had the most trouble with was the idea of privilege. The notion that privilege was somehow an insult really ended up putting their backs up, and often a kind of defensiveness would enter into the conversation. But after a while, it became sort of easy for me to launch these conversations, but it took a little while. It's funny because some of the conversations in the book seemed not to go well, but they were interesting to me because they sort of demonstrated the ways in which we go off on tangents in these conversations that allow us to stay in the place where we're most comfortable. And so there were conversations with a guy, for example, whose son didn't get into Yale. And I was sort of interested in his assumption that a person of color would have taken the seat that his son should have had. What I was surprised at in my own self in that conversation was my own lack of stamina, actually, to stay with it. I ended up getting pretty exhausted talking to him, partly because you find yourself in a kind of circular logic with someone who is unable to see other pathways outside of their thinking. But even the failures were interesting in terms of these conversations. In the making of this book, one of the things I thought about is, what is a conversation, period? What is it? Why do we engage in them? And I began to see them as a kind of building exercise. You engage with another person, hopefully, to enlarge the way in which you think about the world. So at times we're in improvisational conversations, the kind with the men on the airport. You just encounter somebody, you know nothing about them. Other conversations are with friends, others are business conversations. Other conversations are actions, like the protests, where people are out in the streets saying a thing to the public, expecting a response, whether it's simply you blow your horn of your car to say, yes, I agree with you, or like our president, you get the military to come in and tear gas and silence the protesters. So the conversation, it's a very alive thing. It's a very wild thing. It's in play on every level. It's in play personally, socially, politically, and takes many forms. Even the form that the book takes itself is trying to mimic levels of conversation. So its citational aspect has to do with a kind of call and response. I really felt like it was necessary to bring in other voices, whether it was through images, which for me became a kind of citational mechanism, or the work of other writers. I'm able to say what I can say because this person did this kind of research, or CNN did this show on children's biases. Every choice I made in terms of what should be included in the book was a way of expanding, opening up, problematizing the conversation. There have been a lot of written about whether anti-racist training really changes people or whether conversations change people. And for me, I'm not that interested. I would like white supremacy to be disrupted, but I'm more interested in the idea that conversations around the construction of whiteness, racism, implicit bias, allows us to name a dynamic that is happening that has until now gone unnamed. And I don't think it will necessarily change what people do, but it will put us both in the same reality. So when I say, you're being defensive, you might say, sure, I'm being defensive, but I don't care. That's not change exactly, but it's change in that we are now both standing together, seeing the same thing. And you can then, take whatever position you want to take. So it's not about disruption. For me, it's more about naming and about sharing, opening out into a reality that allows us to be in the same place at the same time. Because often I find myself talking to people and they say, I never knew about that. Or you are saying white privilege, but I've never had privilege. And then I'm like, wait a second, you think I'm talking about economic privilege. I'm talking about the privilege you get by simply being white. That's it. And the disadvantages I have by simply being Black. That's it. So that allows us to share a definition. Where we go from there, that's on the individual. I can't really account for that.